Welcome to our series on news stories of race and religion, brought to you by the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion in the Keough School of Global Affairs here at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. This is our third session, and we have an 8-part series. So we are almost halfway there. Interestingly, next week will be the fourth class. It goes very quickly. And guiding us on this journey is Professor David Hooker. He's a professor of the practice at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame. He's also the former Assistant Attorney General of the great state of Georgia. We are tremendously grateful to him for facilitating these sessions. He is a very busy man, and next week Notre Dame begins its spring semester. And so we are firing up our classes on campus as well. So thank you, Professor, for doing this for us. Last week, or actually the first week when we started, we talked about the DC riots, which were fresh in the news, and the elections in Georgia, the 2 senatorial races that were won by the Democrats. And last week, we talked about how we see reality through stories, and how we understand race and religion through the narratives we believe and we tell ourselves. Today, the topic is on critical race theory, and I hope you had a chance to go over the readings. They were short, but very substantive. There was a CNN piece defining for us what critical race theory is, an NPR story on the entanglement of white supremacy and Christianity in the American South, and then a statement from the Southern Baptist Convention on critical race theory and intersectionality. So we look forward to the discussion today. After Professor Hooker speaks with a brief introduction, a few panelists will join him on the screen. These panelists are selected based on the responses to the email that's sent out prior to the class. And we try to rotate them. So if you've given multiple responses, we rotate people so we get different people a chance to be on the screen. But even if you're not on the screen, we hope you will participate behind the scenes through the Q&A function on the bottom. And from time to time, the professor may actually invite you in the middle of the class, for those who are interested, to just raise your hand and pop in if you'd like to make a contribution on the screen. With that, welcome again, and let me turn it over to Professor David Hooker.
Mahan, thank you. These sessions do go very fast. I'm not sure that we get to the full 8 weeks, but we'll see where we go. So welcome, everybody. Welcome. I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight. Now, what I want to make sure that you know is that we're using critical race theory and the response to critical race theory by the Southern Baptist Convention. So we're not going to look at the history, the structure, the theology of the Southern Baptist Convention specifically. And we're going to understand critical race theory, but only in so much as we're working with narratives. And so one of the things I'm excited about is that some of our panelists, claim to know little to nothing of the Southern Baptist Convention. They may only have a passing understanding, passing familiarity with the notions of critical race theory. And that's perfect, because what our focus is on is narrative. And so what I wanted to do is just remind you, even as we talk about, the title again is New Stories, Imagining New Stories for Religion and Race. But those stories, and this is kind of a bit of a summary or kind of a review of some of the things that we talked about before. Stories are constructed inside of a narrative frame, right? So a story, again, generally has a similar structure, beginning, middle, end, with characters, plot, background, an arc to the story. If there's no arc, if there's no movement in it, then it may just be a list of events as opposed to being crafted as a story. And the stories are told with different genres. And so a news story is different from a fairy tale, is different from a fiction story, even though they maintain some of the story structure, right? And so we're familiar with stories, and we often interchange the word story with narrative, but we're trying in this class to, or this web session, to avoid that collapsing those two ideas because of the power that narrative has in relationship to story. And so what a narrative is a it's a structure, it's a system, it's a way of connecting multiple stories, it's a sense making. And so narratives typically don't have a beginning and an end. They create a trajectory, they create understandings or expectations, and then stories get told inside of those narratives. And so what we want to look at for our conversation this evening is what narratives are being crafted by the Southern Baptist Convention, and in what way would the inclusion, based on what we were able to see just from their statement, in what way might the inclusion of a different set of narratives, the narratives that are constructed by the underlying assumptions of critical race theory, how, if at all, do those two intersect, interact? Why would it be necessary for one narrative to reject the other? But before we do that, I just want to play a little bit with notions of narrative. And so I want to invite the panelists to join us and then to introduce themselves so that we can then start to play a little bit. So I want Jane, Charlie, Levi, come on. Where'd they go?
I'm here.
Okay. All right. Perfect. So just Stephanie, Charlie, Levi, Jane, would you just introduce yourselves to the rest of the group? In that, I gave you all order, so.
My name is Stephanie Mirza. I'm a member of the Islamic Society of Michiana.
Nice. Good. How long have you been in or around Michiana?
About 5 years.
Okay. All right. Welcome. Thank you. And I appreciate you playing tonight. This is going to be fun. Charlie.
Yeah, my name is Charlie Pine. I moved here to South Bend a year and a half ago to participate as a member of the Inspired Leadership Initiative at the University of Notre Dame, and delighted to be a part of the community.
Great. Perfect. Levi.
So, hello, my name is Levi Makarios. I'm from
Levi.
Indonesia. I am currently now an undergraduate student at the Indonesian Christian Seminary.
Perfect.
So,
Wow.
looking forward to the conversation.
We are so honored that you will be willing to get up and join us at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning to be part of this conversation. So welcome. Jane. You're muted.
Jane Pitts. I've been around here for a long time. Worked at Notre Dame, no longer work there, live in South Bend, and I'm a Catholic, part of a women's interfaith dialogue group.
Great.
So is Stephanie.
Great. So the first thing I want to do, so thank you all very much. The first thing I want to do is kind of talk about and remember the way that narratives shape our lives, right? So just remembering that narratives have a way of either consciously or unconsciously shaping our behavior, our meaning-making strategies, our relationships. All of those are contained by narratives, many of which we have not uncovered. They're just, some of them are given to us, some of them we have built for ourselves, but they're narratives. And so the way that I wanted to kind of demonstrate that was to ask if any of you have a really quick story about a time you were either surprised or disappointed by behavior of somebody that you don't know very well, or that you don't know maybe at all. You don't know them so well. And something that they did either surprised you or disappointed you. Do one of you have a story about that you'd be willing to share with us?
I do. I don't know if it's on the right track of what you're thinking.
Perfect.
Does it have to be any specific?
Nope.
Okay. So as a small business owner, I attended a conference at a local hotel for small business owners. And one of our governmental representatives was there. I won't name names. And we were new to the area, and I thought, oh, that's neat. I've never met, a representative, a congressperson. And that person was right there in the entry as you walked in. Mm-hmm. And I just went up to her and said, hello, and I was maybe 2 feet from her, and she acted like I wasn't there at all, that I was an apparition or something. Mm-hmm. And I was completely shocked because I've never been treated invisibly before. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure a lot of people have experienced that, but I had never experienced that. And I think it's because that I appear Muslim, and maybe they didn't want to engage with someone who was Muslim. And so I did try again to say hello, thinking maybe she's hard of hearing or something. Mm-hmm. It was completely a wall. So I just moved on.
Perfect. So this is my first assertion. I don't know if it's true or not, but I operate as though it's true. I act as though it's true. I would say that you're never surprised or disappointed by the facts that are in front of you. What is surprising is that the facts that are in front of you, or the observations that you're making, there's a gap between those and the narrative that you're using to guide your life. The facts themselves aren't surprising. They just are surprising or disappointing in relationship to a narrative that you've constructed. So tell me about the narrative that you have of government representatives that would, so that stuck with you, so that it was noticeable to you that they didn't engage you.
Right. So I guess my narrative would be that government representatives listen to their constituents. They want to meet them. Mm-hmm. They recognize them. Mm-hmm. And they go out of their way to do that at times. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's why it was so shocking to me.
Mm-hmm. So that's like just something that you made up, right? Like this is what, or not that you made it up. It's often, okay. This is the narrative about how, this is an imagination that we have. It's a narrative that we have of somebody who fits in that category. And so we anticipate that their behavior is going to be a particular way, and then we're surprised when it's not, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what happens is we have narratives that are operating, and we place other people as characters, as we position them inside of our narrative, not necessarily with their agreement. This is why I didn't want to talk about somebody that you're married to, because in marriage, you actually create an agreement. You actually create a contract and a set of agreements about how you all are going to behave. And so disappointment in that is a whole nother thing. And I don't want to get into any whole relationship thing and, get people upset about, marital stuff. So, but in other places, we often stick people into, we position people in a narrative, and we invite them to assume a particular role, or we create expectations for them. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So, Ronnie, welcome. And some of those narratives are kind of globalized in particular ways. So when I say globalized, they're meta narratives, they're larger narratives, and they have multiple strands. And so, Stephanie, I'm going to stay with you for just a second, because you said you appeared, maybe you got that reaction because you appeared Muslim, right? Mm-hmm. So that's like the reflective thing. Like, I think I do, I think that they think I do. And so I think that the behavior that they're giving me is inside of their narrative of Muslim, right?
Yeah.
What, without actually knowing, without having had the opportunity to investigate or, nuance it with the government representative, what are possible narratives of Muslim or Muslimina, or whatever, that you imagine the governmental representative could have, not that they did have, but that they could have, that would cause them to pull back and say, I don't really want to be connected to this person?
That Muslims are dangerous, or that maybe I'm have critical opinions about her. I didn't know much about her to begin with, so sure. I don't know what her opinions are on foreign policy. Maybe she didn't know if I spoke English or not.
Even though you said hello. that's
yeah, but I've gotten that before, where people are like, can you speak English? And so, whatever, I guess those are the kind of things that she might have been thinking. I don't know.
Great. Okay. Just
also,
along.
One more thing, maybe because it was like a little conference for small business owners, she probably did not expect that I was part of that or something. Maybe she thought I was in the wrong place because she wasn't expecting a Muslim to be in a small business program.
So when others hear and just reflect on that kind of, so that wasn't a personal exchange, by the way. That was an exchange of narratives. That was an narrative interacting with another narrative and kind of reverberating off of, because you don't know her, because she doesn't know you. And so that's why I would make the claim that it wasn't a personal exchange. She wasn't ignoring you because she doesn't know you. She wasn't ignoring, that there wasn't a personal animus or personal reactivity. It was narrative reacting to narrative, right? Which is how most of our exchanges and interactions are in the world, because, there are some people that we know, some people that we know less well, some people we don't know at all, but we are often interacting with and making meaning of our exchanges with them. Just any reflections, thoughts from our other panelists just about that exchange right there, because that's going to lead us directly into where we were going tonight.
It's
Well,
just
I
very
think,
helpful to have have an example where you can illustrate the two narratives, nothing personal, but two narratives meeting each other. Thank you.
Ronnie, you were going to say,
I was going to say something. I think that there are a lot of people, somewhat to my surprise, who don't know any people of color. They don't know any Asians, they don't know any Buddhists, they don't know any Muslims, they don't know any Black people. And so without actually knowing anybody from one of those people groups, they make all these assumptions. And I mean, I'm always so amazed that people are so narrow-minded that they don't even grasp like the silliness of what they're saying. You know, it would be like, I don't know, I don't like football and you've never watched it or you knew nothing about it.
mhm,
But this is much more serious. And I think it's, I think it's getting to be a time where people are going to have to change.
mhm. So that's our work. That is our work.
Right.
Levy, uh, Charlie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciate, David, how you frame this from a narrative to narrative interchange. I think what strikes me about it is as you unpack it, share it, that there's a certain speculative nature to it.
Mm-hmm.
Hearing about an interaction between two people, that I appreciate your distinction that that doesn't make it interpersonal because they didn't actually have connection history with one another. But hearing Stephanie retell it, we're hearing one side where she is unpacking and then we're being invited. But it's just helpful for me to be reminded that there is a speculative nature of exploring what might be some of the narratives on the other side. And I appreciated as Stephanie shared the story, even the part of I repeated myself because I thought maybe there's another explanation
Mm-hmm.
to this. And yet it's like, okay, I took another step and kind of ruled that out.
Mm.
And but it still leads into, yeah, we're making educated guesses as to what might be on the other side of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Levy, any thoughts?
Actually, I think what should we say, the developing, not conflict, but the friction between race or ethnicity is kind of, yes, based on assumption, but I think because I came from an Asian culture, the assumption in the American society is often based on what they see or what they've been told, right? Like some narrative about Muslim example or any race. So they assume uh, every everybody else, right, have the same um, activity or like that. But actually, in Indonesia, the narrative is often framed in what our nation motto is, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, or meaning different but still one.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, because in Indonesia we have a lot, like a lot of ethnicity arrays. So what happened is sometimes gradually developing interethnic conflict in Indonesia is about subordination of one another.
Mm.
So it's like one race is have much more people than the other, so they start to see themselves subordinate to other ethnicity. Or now when the ethnicity intersectional with the religion itself, it makes more uh, I could say fun, because we have something like a ethnicity with Muslim religion, or ethnicity with Christian religion. It kind of makes a new friction, because in here at the end religion almost comes on top. Like
Mhm.
even we have the same ethnicity like Chinese or another ethnicity. In the end, like the religion aspect
Uh-oh. I can't tell.
to all of the, yes, like that. So in Indonesia, the religion aspect is so important more than the ethnicity itself, I think.
Mhm. Mhm. And I know that to be the case in many parts of the world. Um, Religion has a more defining set of assumptions and more constraining narratives than do racial or ethnic categories. And it's the same work. In some places, um, race or ethnicity, in some places, religion, in some places, it's something altogether different. It's not race or religion, so it's not always that. But there are a set of assumptions and narratives that are made, like there are narratives that are crafted about particular groups in certain ways, and we try to preserve those narratives. And the narratives, because the narratives shape our behavior and our meaning making. So that's what we're really investigating, is how narratives shape our behavior, how they shape our relationships, how they shape our meaning making. Um, and so this interaction, or this rejection of an interaction between the Southern Baptist Convention and the notions of critical race theory seem to be a way of taking a look at those two. Um, if you Did you get a chance to look at the resolution that the Southern Baptist Convention constructed? Yeah. Um, so if you notice in the resolution, um, they said things like, whereas scripture, meaning the biblical text, are whole, sufficient. I don't remember exactly the language, but is a sufficiently holistic framework within which to make meaning and address modern social concerns. And so how does that, so what they were doing, I want you to notice in the resolution, and I'll invite you to go back and look at it again. I can't pull it up on the screen, but I'll invite you to go back and look at it again to notice how they were constructing narrative. Those whereas is what narratives do, is they give assumptions and they shape behavior. They create the assumptions, they shape behavior, and then that within that narrative is the framework within which a story can be told. I want to make sure we got that. You all see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So do you have the capacity to, from where you are, to look at the resolution? So what might be something that was being said in the resolution that was part of the shaping of the narrative that they were trying to construct?
Southern Baptist Convention resolution.
Can you ask that question again?
So if you read some of the, like I want you to see if you can pull out some of the places or some of the statements inside of the resolution that were part of their effort to construct a narrative. Because the idea is we're constructing a narrative and we're constraining it so that meaning making, our epistemology, our way of knowing, our way of acting and thinking happens within certain bounds.
So would one example of this be, whereas critical race theory and intersectionality have been appropriated by individuals with worldviews that are contrary to the Christian faith, resulting in ideologies and methods that contradict scripture.
Right. And so what they're doing there is saying that the narrative that we have creates boundaries for behavior, right? That's what narratives do. Narratives shape our behavior. Narratives shape our meaning-making strategy. And so when you apply critical race theory, you are necessarily operating outside of the bounds of what's acceptable behavior inside the narrative that we've constructed. Do you see that?
It's interesting. One of the things says, whereas the scriptures teach that Eve is the mother of all living, Genesis 3:20, and that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, whoever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him, Acts 10:34, and that God has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, except that almost is ignoring Genesis 1:27.
Well, so yes, and we're creating an epistemological structure. This is the work of narrative. We're creating a framework, a boundary for our epistemology. These are the ways of making meaning. These are the interpretive strategies that we're using that allow us to arrive at a final conclusion.
I mean, the next couple of whereas are pretty significant. And I think there's still a lot of racism in the church today, despite what churches say.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily want to
go in that direction.
No, I don't want to disagree with you on that point. I don't want to necessarily go in that direction. But what I want to say is that the Southern Baptist Convention is creating an understanding that would suggest that if there is racism in the church, that the scriptural foundation or the texts are sufficiently articulated in ways to deal with that, so that you don't need to bring in another interpretive system. What the argument is, scriptures are an interpretive system, whole, complete, perfect interpretive system. The problematic is critical race theory is bringing up, is introducing another interpretive system or epistemological framework. Stephanie.
Okay, there is a lot that I disagree with in the statement, and what Ronnie said, I concur with that. And even a lot of problematic things in the statement, but my understanding is that the critical race theory and intersectionality can be, like, if you look in the resolved, they're not numbered, but the second resolved, that critical race theory and intersectionality should only be employed as analytical tools subordinate to scripture, not as transcendent ideological frameworks, and so on. But that they're not saying that intersectionality or critical race theory is bad itself, just that the overarching structure needs to be scripture as the final say so. And within that, you can use critical race theory as tools to, address things. I don't necessarily agree with, some of the premises, but that's what I understand.
Right. So the question is, if you accept their whereases, if you were able to step into their world to embrace the whereases as they have laid them out, does their approach or relationship to critical race theory make sense? This is the hardest part of like being with someone with whom you have a different narrative frame, is it's really hard sometimes to step into and wholly, like, even for the moment, to suspend the possibility or to hold the possibility that they could be right and embrace it enough to see what they're actually saying. Jane, you were about to say something? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No,
Charlie.
I think as I hear you voice that, I think another way of expressing what I think I hear you saying is there consistency in what they've presented? Is it coherent? That's part of what I hear you expressing out of that. And it's very interesting to me. When I first started reading it the very first time, it was a very interesting response on my part of feeling like the whereas were bouncing a bit between, it gave me an appreciation of them trying to walk this fine line of, we don't want to say that we're rejecting this completely, but we are setting up some boundaries, and we can't fully embrace this. And watching that kind of unfold through the statements.
So one thing I guess I'm trying to do it slightly differently, not to ask if what they're saying is coherent. Because if I'm listening for coherence, what I'm trying to do is test their narrative like against one that I already have.
I would say I see that. I see what you're saying, but I see that a little differently. Maybe the phrase like, is it internally coherent? I think the way you just voiced it is, if we could step into that world, which I would say is a little easier for me, given I have some background that approximates some of these things. So when you were speaking earlier about sufficiency of the scriptures, the other word that they put in there, which I've just been in a lot of communities where this is very common lingo, is it's the other word that you might have been fishing for, but they use two words. One is the authority and the sufficiency of the scriptures, which I think is very much what you were getting to, is within this narrative. I think the word authority is a really critical one. What is the authority by which we can evaluate? And so to me, I think the coherence, I agree with you that our tendency is to use our own narrative framework to evaluate someone else's coherency. But what I hear you saying is, if we can step into theirs, which can be very challenging, but if we were to do so, do we find it at all convincing? Is there an internal consistency? Do their whereas statements,
Mhm.
can I suspend judgment on them long enough to ask, is there an internal consistency where if I can accept their starting points,
Mhm.
can I find my way to similar conclusions?
Right. Right. Jane, you were about to say something, and then I'm going to loop back to Stephanie.
Go back to Stephanie first. I'm not about.
Okay. Well, when you put it that way, then I guess I would say yes. But that's assuming that I am white, I am Southern Baptist, and everything that goes with that. And with that understanding, then of course, the Bible is going to have all the solutions, and we're all different, and that's how God created us, and that's just fine.
Mhm.
That makes sense reading this.
Mhm.
And with that,
Mhm.
I wouldn't see a need to change anything. And I think that's what critical race theory is really challenging people to do, is to change your perspective so you can.
Right. Which is why I think Charlie's point about the authority of Scripture, like, so the thing that you can't change, like within the bounds of Scripture as authoritative, if there are places to play where critical race theory might be helpful, then please feel free to go ahead and use it. Levy, I'm wondering, from slightly outside of this debate, this is kind of a U.S. centric debate, but I wonder how it relates, or how you experience this whole conversation.
I mean, in a bigger picture, it's make a lot of sense in a way. Like um, in here, we are using our nation model as the authoritative power, right? So in here, like the problem, the way to solve the problem is to come back to the nation, because we believe in the big narrative of different but one. I mean, even we come from different ethnicity, we are still one. So yes, there are some ethnicity conflict or religion conflict happen here in Indonesia, like the real thing, like when ethnicity, religion, or in their ethnicity. But in the end, we always construct the story or the narrative that if you want to blame or if you want to uh, tell something about race, it's not about their race or the ethnicity or their religion. It's about the person. So, an example, here in Indonesia, the majority is Muslim. So we have a lot of uh, conflict, right? So the but in Indonesia we never kind of look the Muslim like generalizing, like, oh, they are Muslim, they are bad. No, we are still doing the normal stuff. The bad is the people, not the ethnicity or the religion. So because at the end we kind of in the big picture of Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, different but one. When the person is not doing well, I mean, like there's a conflict or uh, you know uh, the conflict. So in the end, we just kind of have a conclusion that this person is not belong in the country. If somebody doing some stuff like conflict or bombing or killing or something like that, whatever the reason, the main issue is he is not the he is not honor the country, because one of our principle or ideology of the country, the first one is having belief in a God, believe in one true God. So we respect each other, but when we use, let's say, one religion or one ethnicity to justify our doing to another, that's when things got, we call that a problem, when you don't respect another ethnicity or uh, another religion. So I think it's interesting when I read the intersectionality and the critical race, when
Mhm.
I read the whereas Christian citizenship is not based on our difference, but instead on our common salvation. I mean, I can relate that not only in a Christian way, but in our nation way. But because uh, the common in belief in God, what is the God itself, kind of make us unite and uh, not base the judging to other people based in our differences, but yeah, it's kind of subordinative to the our friend of atheists or don't believe in God. But as long as you in the framework of some religion, we have the same amount of respect regarding the ethnicity. Like I said in here, often uh, religion is more higher than the ethnicity. But I mean, in above that, we have a country that kind of united all, because we came from a thousand of different ethnicity and hundred of religion. So I think the the mindset that our country is above everything, but about the country is always make good, not the people, right? So
Mhm.
we never kind of blame the people, the religion or the ethnic, just the very people that doing that. I think that's my no.
Sure. So that's actually a really helpful framing to notice that there is a dominant narrative which says that the authoritative framework for analysis of conflicts is with the nation as kind of the highest order. Like we have to always come back to preserving the nation, and the nation is made for good. And so all of the subordinate kinds of conflicts and concerns have to be evaluated in ways that don't supplant the significance, the superiority, or the overarching authority of the nation, which is exactly what the what this resolution is doing, is saying that whatever other analytical frameworks you would like to adopt, they will all, particularly like critical race theory, they should be subordinate to the overarching, thank you, Charlie, authority and sufficiency of the scripture. Jane, I'm coming back to you. You sent me away before, I'm back.
I was struck by the narrative within which the Southern Baptist Conference lives, moves, has its being, but it's willing to examine critical theory, but it's not willing to absorb it. as part of its narrative.
Oh, yeah, no, they're not really willing to examine it. What they were doing, there are 4 really large, majority African American churches in the Southern Baptist Convention who have pastors who use critical race theory as a major part of their analytical strategy in their sermoning and their teaching and everything like that. And they were using critical race theory as part of the way to critique the structure of the church. And so the way that you limit the power of their critique is by saying that that critique has arisen from an ideology that is outside of the scriptures, because that critique is being used to test our interpretation of the scriptures. So it's examining it for a purpose. It's examining it to very clearly reposition it in response to internal conflict in the church, in the denomination. Right. Charlie.
Yeah, and I think I just was going to make an observation. I really feel like the other resource that you shared with us this week, the NPR article, I think that really brings to light, and for me, having posed the question earlier, is this internally consistent, coherent? I would say that's where you actually experience a breakdown, is this argument that the scriptures are authoritative, sufficient to deal with all this. But then you bring a resource like that in, which essentially says, okay, if this is sufficient, if this authoritative narrative is sufficient to handle all of this, then why do we have this deep-rooted history? And I love your comment you just chimed in, David, was the power to interpret. And so you have this history of people who shared this consensus with you in that the scriptures are sufficient, and yet you have this story that's unpacked that says people operating out of this have this history of complicity with these issues. And so what gives? And I know that there are people who would say, well, yeah, well, then they will start coming back to, well, it was a fault of their interpretation. They didn't interpret it accurately enough. But I think that's the beginning of challenging that narrative, is that, for me, that becomes the inconsistency of, we're not dealing just with this narrative versus this narrative, but your own narrative begins to break down when you put it into this context where you're making an argument. But yeah, as we look at a resource like the NPR article, and what's behind that is, how do you deal with that inconsistency of, you have this, again, history of people claiming the same authority being in religious texts, and yet, did not bring forth the ideals that you pull bits and pieces that it should have produced this, but how do you explain that it hasn't? And I think that's what then brings us back to the theme of this course. Where do we look? How do we reimagine new? And I think, yeah, these resolutions we don't need anything new. We need to just preserve what we already have. And to me, that becomes the sticky point of, well, no, what we've had has not produced the ideals that you claim come forth from this. And so what do we do with that? Where do we then begin to look for the new stories, new narratives that will, in fact, bring us to what we claim our stated ideals.
Ronnie, I couldn't tell when you sat up if that was because you were about to lean in. You were about to say something.
No, I was writing something.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I
All right.
was
All right.
writing something.
So this is kind of in response to Charlie's question. Where do we begin? How do we begin to imagine or even think about imagining kind of a new way of thinking? How do we get outside of what we've been given? I wonder if any of you have a story or experience of having just kind of absorbed, not necessarily been taught, but just in a particular kind of cultural context in which you've grown up, you absorbed a particular narrative, and then you found yourself in a place that caused you to question, then narrate that circumstance. Like, do you know what I'm asking?
Yes.
So part of the reason, so I should say this. I don't say this often enough. I'm a recovering attorney, right?
Recovery or recovering?
Recovering. I am a recovering. It's a day-to-day thing. I am a recovering attorney. I'm a recovering trial lawyer, right? One of my skill sets is I can ask you a question in which the only available answers are the answers that I want you to have. I know how to do that. And so sometimes when you hear me kind of mumbling around in a question and creating the vagueness, there's an intention to not be directing you towards something, but to leave it open enough that you can find your way into it. So if it feels a bit vague and ethereal, I'm doing that, right? I get that that's what's happening.
Ronnie, were you going to say that you said you understood the question? Were you going to relay an experience related to it?
I do. I was going to say something. My family genealogy, goes back, the first relatives came in the early 1600s. And a lot of people fought in the Revolutionary War, and aunts and people in the past have all been, daughters of the American Revolution. And over the years, as I've read some of these things, and maybe it's because I have spent many years being a healthcare provider where I have not only worked with all kinds of people, but taken care of all kinds of people. I got to thinking about some of those family people who died and made you queen. Oh, wait, that was my family. And so there were a lot of things that were just part of growing up. And I have spent, and more recently over the last 2 or 3 years, but different times in the last decade or so, really looking at how I really feel about things, how I feel about racism and people of other races, and a lot of the situations that exist in our world. And I thought, wow, I used to just think these things were, 10, 20 years ago, I'd walk into Home Depot and so many signs would be in Spanish. And I would think to myself, why don't they learn English? Well, I didn't know any Hispanic people at that point. So how, I hadn't put myself in the situation to know anybody. Now I know quite a few. I know quite a few African American people. I know a lot of, Pakistani people. And so I have had to rethink over the last few decades what it is I really think about things. And
so do you have like even a small thing like where you operated in one narrative and then just a small little exchange, and it had to shift either ever so slightly or significantly because like your experience caused you to shift the narrative? Because what happens is we're talking about new stories in race and religion, which are huge, complex narratives that fit inside of every aspect of your being. It's in your, your diet and your aesthetics and your relationships and your, ritual practices and what you read and everything. And so we can't imagine shifting everything. And it's not necessary to shift everything, but the idea is when you're doing paradigm shifts, you identify small places where the paradigm has drifted just a little bit. And so it's easier to take on a small shift than it is to imagine the overwhelming aspect of a large one. So I wonder if you can think of even a small, you said, I'm rethinking things. I wonder if there's even one small thing, like
Yes.
it could be this, if there's one small thing.
So for a few summers, I hired a Mexican man to do yard work for me. And my thought probably 10, 15 years ago was people shouldn't come here undocumented. But then I got to know this person and know about his family and know his situation. And if he had a way to become a citizen, he would certainly do that. And I know then I came to meet some other Mexicans who had walked from wherever they lived in Mexico, Puebla, which is southeast of Mexico City, to California. And they have worked at every single job known to man. And they do it without complaining. And they too have said, if we could become citizens, without getting deported in the process, we would certainly do that, but we don't have that opportunity. And I think there was a restaurateur in South Bend who had checked in every year with immigration, followed all the rules, was in the process of becoming a citizen. And one year when he went to check in, I don't know, they arrested him. And, I think that was wrong. So I have a very different feeling about people that are here undocumented, especially people that are now young adults whose parents brought them when they were babies. What did they have to say about it? Absolutely nothing. So in that would be one example I have of changing how I feel.
So in many households, cultures, communities, when children are young, in families where Christmas is part of the cultural kind of, is part of the culture in some way, children are often introduced to the mythology of Santa Claus, right?
Right.
They're told Santa brings presents, Santa sits, Santa observes your behavior, Santa does these kinds of things. There's a Santa Claus. There comes a time for many people, I hope this is a spoiler alert. I hope, I should have checked. This is a spoiler alert. There comes a time when people come to be aware that this Santa thing is just a myth. I hope I haven't ruined that for anybody, right?
Yep.
Often, even after they grow up knowing it's a myth, they turn around and teach their children Santa Claus. There are a lot of things, particularly as it relates to race and ethnicity, like even the notion that race has no biological construct, that race is a social, it has no biological basis. It's a social construct. It's a thing that's framed. It's a narrative that's framed in order to explain other bases, other hierarchical relationships and distribution of power and authority and value among different groups of people. And yet, we operate inside of we continue to operate inside of the myth, even after having come to understand it as being mythology. Sometimes it's easier just because the society is constructed that way. But if you're trying to craft a new story, the question is, what, if anything, might you do to operate just in some small ways outside of that mythology? Similarly, most of us who grow up in any religious or spiritual tradition we absorb certain narratives, and at different times in our lives, we grow up and we have different kinds of experiences beyond the bounds of our childhood, where we are invited to reconsider the texture of that myth. Like, is it rigid? Is it porous? Is it not the larger thing, but some small parts of the narrative that are constructed inside of what's called particular religion or faith tradition of some sort? We have the opportunity to reevaluate certain parts of that. Yeah.
May I say something?
Sure.
So when my middle son was 8, he was at that point of not really believing in Santa. And I saw an ad in the newspaper that you could hire Santa to come to your house. But we were going to South Bend that weekend. So, I called the guy, gave him the whole scenario. He comes to the door, and who answers the door but the son? And he sees Santa there. And of course, my older son is upstairs rolling his eyes, and the little child wouldn't come down at all. And Santa said, "Oh, Peter, I'm so glad you're here. I thought you would have left for South Bend already." And he gives him this whole scenario and brings him, of course, the presents he wanted. And Peter was thunderstruck. And after the guy leaves, because all the presents, of course, were in the back of my car in the driveway, he's looking out the kitchen windows. And I said, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "I'm just looking to see if I could see Santa's sleigh." Now, this is in the daytime. So this is a kid who's already, knowing, I'm sure from his friends, that this probably isn't really true. So moving ahead several years, his wife is Mexican. And though they acknowledge Christmas as the birth of Jesus, and they get one gift, and they have a Christmas tree, they get their gifts on Three Kings Day, because that is a more Hispanic way of celebrating. So it kind of moves.
Yeah. So the thing that I'm trying to play with is the idea that there are ways in which narratives that are framed inside of or stories, ideas, constructs, behavioral paradigms that are framed inside of a religious foundation or a faith-based or a religious foundation often intersect with narratives that are framed from the perspective of race. They either intersect well or they don't. And because these are two of the many kind of dominant narrative systems, structures that we operate in, it's often hard to see. They get absorbed, they get built into structures, they get built into instruction, they get built into children's stories, they get built into so many things. And so it's hard to see them. And together they often create hierarchies and centers of power and centers of and margins and exclusion and things like that. And that's really what I'm just trying to play with. I'm just trying to see where and how we look at that at all, and whether there's any benefit to looking at it. If by re-examining or crafting new stories, it creates spaces for more inclusion, for full flourishing, for anything like that. If there's any value in crafting new or even modifying old or existing narratives in either of those spaces or at the intersection. That's the thing that I'm inviting us to play with. I realize we're bumping up against the end of our time. This thing goes really fast. Levy, go ahead.
Actually, I really like the what you're saying about the narrative and stuff, because in Indonesia here we have suffered the conflict about race and religion until maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I mean the big one, but the concept of paradigm shift through the generation is what we are trying to do here, right now. As an example, as I grew up, often we hear story about some ethnicity or some religion is bad. I mean, like not just story from some distant story, made from our own family, our in here, because the conflict is ethnic and religion. We often, I mean, like my grandma's house was burned when the conflict arise. So the problem is real, but at some point we just realize, what's the point of us creating this kind of differentiate one another? There's just no use. So we shifting through the better ways of seeing religion and ethnicity, not as not as a way to subordinate one another. So in example, we hear a majority of us in here are Muslim, the minority is Christianity. There's a history of conflict and the victim genocide and something like that. But now the region leader is a Christian. So and the region leader is not the ethnicity from the majority of our region. So Indonesia have trying to shift the paradigm, not based on the ethnicity or the religion, like you said, but slowly shifting into why we differentiate ourselves from them in the first place. Like, why would we subordinate like that? What's the point of playing with power? So at the end, in Indonesia right now, the narrative is always about seeing race and religion. Yes, they are different, but not to make us different. You know what I mean? Like, yes, there are different race, different ethnicity. So the only thing that matters is we know that every religion, every race, every ethnicity uh, have the goodness inside. So if
So
we
Levi,
assume,
Levy, that's
yes,
actually perfect as a way to, I know because we bumped up against the end of our time, but what you've just said for many communities and cultures is the future. So we're glad that you're calling from the future, right? You're calling from tomorrow, where it may be that others are able to find a time to or a way to figure out that difference doesn't devalue one or the other. That difference is just an interesting thing. And so even as you all are working on it, other groups are working on it. And so we appreciate you calling in from the future. I appreciate Jane and Charlie and Stephanie and Ronnie all also joining us for the panel today. Thank you. The time flies, but I really appreciate your willingness to lean in for the conversation. And I look forward to having more conversation next week.